I'm Aimee Ng, curator at the Frick Collection in New York, and welcome to another episode of Cocktails with a Curator. It's been a few tough months here in New York City, but finally, summer is upon us. And in celebration of summer and in honor of the subject of today's episode, which is an 18th century British painting by Thomas Gainsborough, I thought I'd indulge in a Pimm's cup, which is a typical summer drink across the UK. Although in the UK, I think it's not called a Pimm's cup. It's just called a Pimm's or a Pimm's #1. But in America, we call this a Pimm's cup. And Pimm's was a liqueur that was invented in the 1820s by a London oyster bar owner, James Pimm's. And like many drinks in British history, this too was invented with a sort of health benefit. Pimm's was supposed to aid with digestion. Now, Pimm's #1 is a gin-based liqueur. Pimm's #2, 3, 4, and so on are based on other spirits, all of them with a secret mix of spices and herbs. Typical Pimm's is Pimm's #1 mixed with an English-style lemonade, so a sparkling lemonade, and you can also use ginger ale and garnished with fresh things like cucumber, strawberries, raspberries, mint, what have you. This is the official drink of Wimbledon, which unfortunately was canceled this year for obvious reason. But anyway, cheers to you, our viewer. That really puts me in the mood to watch some top-level tennis, but instead I'm going to talk to you about an 18th century British painting. So let's go inside the Frick Collection for a minute. I'm showing you a view of the lovely Fifth Avenue garden on a beautiful summer's day at the Frick, and into one of my favorite galleries in the museum, the dining room, which is hung with wonderful British portraits, these big full lengths by Gainsborough, by Romney. And there's a little painting that can be easy to miss in this room. It's the little portrait on the right. And I was just so happy to show you a photograph of people in the galleries, because this is something we miss so much, our visitors, our public, face to face with works of art. The portrait is the last thing that one sees as one exits the room, and it is Gainsborough's portrait of Grace Dalrymple Elliott. Now, Thomas Gainsborough, most of you know, was one of the leading British artists in the 18th century. And he was predominantly known and made famous as a portraitist, although he was very passionate about making landscape paintings as well. And his clientele as a portraitist, which is really how he made his livelihood and his reputation, ranged from wealthy merchants all the way up to royalty. So he was patronized by King George III and Queen Charlotte as well. He was also one of the founding members of the Royal Academy of Arts, which was an institution created for the promotion of arts in Britain and for artists affiliated with Britain in some way through education and exhibition. And it was a relatively international group of artists who founded and were affiliated with the Royal Academy, despite it being based in Britain. First of all, there were 2 women artists among those founding artists, and that was Angelica Kauffman and Mary Moser. And among those who affiliated or showed at the Royal Academy were artists from France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, even a Chinese artist, Tang Jie-kwa, who traveled from Canton to England and showed at the Royal Academy in 1770. Now, the Royal Academy summer exhibitions every year were the most important venue for artists in Britain or affiliated with Britain in some way to show their art, both to the public and to critics. And when Gainsborough showed his portrait of Grace Dalrymple Elliott at the summer exhibition of 1782, it was met with some negative criticism. And it was less to do with any perceived inability on Gainsborough's part. In fact, it was more to do with his having captured his subject a little too well. And according to one commentator, the eyes, as Gainsborough has captured her, were too characteristic of her vocation. Who was Grace Dalrymple Elliott, and what did she do to deserve that? Seems like 18th century critics were just as bad as today's tabloids, if not worse. Well, you can probably guess. She was a beautiful woman who had a number of affairs with prominent members of British and French society. She was born around 1754 in Edinburgh in Scotland, and she had a father, Hugh Dalrymple, who was a barrister, quite wealthy, who was appointed the Attorney General of the Grenadiers, and so left his family to some degree. And that connection to the Grenadiers at the time reminds us that in the background of so many of these works of art produced in Britain in the 18th century is the British Empire's colonization and all of its attendant atrocities. So Hugh Dalrymple goes away, leaves the family, and Grace is raised with her mother for some time until her mother passes away. And at that point, Grace is sent to be educated in a convent in France. Eventually, as a teenager, her father returns and she moves back in with him in England. And it's at her father's home that she meets a man about 20 years her senior, who's a wealthy physician called John Elliott. And he is completely enamored with her as soon as he sees her. She's rumored to be extremely beautiful from a very young age. And he proposes marriage. And at the ripe age of 17, Grace agrees to marry and does marry in St. Pancras, London, John Elliott. It was not a great match. So a couple of years later, he has filed suit for adultery and is actually awarded a pretty hefty monetary settlement. And 5 years after their marriage, so in 1776, he has filed for divorce. Gainsborough actually painted an earlier portrait of Grace before the Frick picture. This full-length portrait of Mrs. Elliott, as she was called for the rest of her life, even after the divorce, was painted and shown at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in 1778, just a couple of years after her pretty scandalous divorce from John Elliott. And in this painting, you can see why she earned the nickname Dally the Tall. Very slender, very elongated, and of course, this is exaggerated by her very, very high hairstyle, powdered gray, powdered white, which was the fashion at the time. This portrait was probably commissioned by one of the prominent men with whom she had an association, a relationship. And this was probably commissioned by George, the 4th Earl of Cholmondeley, later the 1st Marquess of Cholmondeley. And they would have a long relationship through her life. She also was associated for a short time with the Prince of Wales, who would become the future king of England as George IV. But in this portrait that I'm showing you, he is still the Prince of Wales. And this is a portrait by Gainsborough Dupont. Gainsborough Dupont being the nephew and only pupil of Thomas Gainsborough. So there was a lot of attention on Grace Dalrymple Elliott when her portrait was shown at the Royal Academy in 1782, this Frick picture, because as the exhibition opened, she had just given birth about a month earlier to her first and only child, a little girl called Georgiana Augusta Frederica, who took the surname Seymour. And this is a portrait of her by Sir Joshua Reynolds at about the age of 3. The father was claimed to be the Prince of Wales, but in fact, Georgiana was raised in the household of Cholmondeley. So there's a lot of notoriety surrounding this situation, and of course, a lot of the negative attention fell on the sitter of this portrait. But I wonder, and one has to wonder, to what degree the artist Gainsborough took advantage to some degree of the sort of high attention that his sitter would attract at the Royal Academy exhibition, and how much then attention would be brought to his painting of her. And it's not just who he's painting, it's also how he has portrayed her. This might not seem like a particularly scandalous or provocative portrait to us now, but if you compare it with her, for example, her full-length portrait, there's a distance, a sort of respectful distance that the sitter, Grace, holds between us, the viewer, and her. We can see it. It's right below her, right under her feet. She's also turned away from us. She's giving us her profile. And, you know, that is both modest and aloof in the style of ancient coins, of early Italian Renaissance portraits. this sense of a kind of indirectness, not meeting our eyes, both modest, as I said, and aloof, a sense of separateness. Instead, in the Frick picture, a full face, direct gaze, looking right out at us. This is a very, very intimate portrait. Look at how close we are to her. And that commentator who drew attention to her eyes, although it was a mean-spirited comment, I think was onto something. If you take a look at the way she looks sort of languidly out at the viewer in a very open way, an encouraging way, eyelids just sort of resting, happy, provocative in this sort of familiar way. And of course, those eyebrows also very expressive, and the darkness of them drawing a very strong contrast to her very, very white skin and her powdered hair. And of course, that white skin, whiteness in skin being a very complex, complicated part of ideal beauty in women for a very, very long time, and in many, many cultures around the world, having to do with class and race and other things. This is especially exaggerated in portraits like this one of a European white woman who exaggerates the whiteness of her skin through the application of white makeup. And very often that white makeup that was being applied included the very deadly lead white. But in addition to the white skin, it's a generous application of red around her cheeks to create this sense of flush. So this rosy cheeks, but also very, very ripe red lips. And if you can see, the lips are just parted a little bit to show a hint of her teeth. One of my favorite details is just the touch of a brush with black paint to mark the beauty spot on her left cheek, which of course was very fashionable at the time. Color is used in a very powerful way in this portrait. From afar, it might seem just like a lot of browns and a lot of whites with a smattering of a few other hues. But if you look closely even at that exaggerated sense of white, this is a play of subtle hues of white on white. So that diaphanous silk lining spilling open from her dress to reveal, to frame that very creamy expanse of the white of her chest and her ample breasts, that too exaggerated by that dark ribbon that is falling between her breasts and attached to a bright blue locket, and that blue probably would have been even more pronounced in the 18th century, surrounded by diamonds and nestled in this very sumptuous ribbon of pink. And it's details like this that really highlight the brevity, quickness, magic of Gainsborough's brushstroke, for which he would become very well known. So a lot of negative attention was falling on both the sitter and this portrait. And I don't want to say that there was one reason why she did this, but I would have to assume that the negative attention she was getting around this time and through the mid-1780s was one of the reasons why Grace, Mrs. Elliott, left England and moved to France for basically the rest of her life in 1786. Unbeknownst to her, she was arriving to France just a few years before the great tumultuous revolution, which would change her life, which would change France, which would change much of the world. This was, of course, not known to her when she moved in 1786. Among the men with whom she had associations and relationships in France, perhaps the most famous was the Duc d'Orléans, of course, a nobility, a person of nobility, but he was also very active in forwarding the revolution, and he was a proponent of constitutional monarchy. And although he himself was a noble, he really did believe in the revolution, and he changed his name from the Duc d'Orléans to Philippe Égalité. But despite his movements and participation in the efforts of the revolution against the Ancien Regime, he too was executed, guillotined, beheaded in the terror of 1793. And I bring this up because Grace was there through all of this. She was there and recorded much of what was happening at the time, from the Women's March on Versailles all the way to the terrors and beheadings and executions of 1793. She records this in a very sensational diary, which she simply titles Journal of My Life During the French Revolution, which was published after her death. And she engages with a number of stories, very, as I said, sensational, but also dramatic accounts. The problem is we don't know how much of it is true. So much of it must be true, but she names a number of prisons at which she is held as a prisoner for some amount of time, but her name has not yet been found on any of those prison lists. But there are also some very human descriptions and accounts in this diary, both having to do with, you know, the issue of class and exactly why the revolution was happening, but also things that were happening specifically to her as a human being. And in one description of her imprisonment in one of these prisons, she recounts that every night she would beg from the turnkey, the man who would lock up at the end of the night. She would beg from him a drop of brandy in order to clean her teeth, because she was unable to wash. The water was very dirty, and she attributes that drop of brandy over that period of time as the only reason why she was able to keep her teeth. All of her other cellmates, she said, lost their teeth. They all fell out. And that comes to mind when I think of those parted lips and the teeth that you can see through them. Now, in terms of the portrait itself, it's a real mystery about how it came about. Who commissioned it is unknown. It seems to have stayed in the artist in Gainsborough's studio until his death. We do not have the account books, the records of sittings for Gainsborough, as we do for many other artists. We just don't have a record of exactly who came in and asked for this. But we do have a mysterious little bill written by Gainsborough's widow after his death. Mrs. Gainsborough writes a bill and addresses it to the Prince of Wales for the head of Mrs. Elliott. And of course, this is referring to the painted head of Mrs. Elliott at a price of £31 and 10 shillings. It's unclear if this bill is ever paid. It does not seem that this portrait ever makes it into the collection of George IV or the Prince of Wales at any of those times. There's a theory that it was inherited by her daughter, Georgiana, who unfortunately died before her mother, 10 years before her mother, at the age of 31. But this, of course, is not substantiated. I'm going to take you on a little bit of an aside, just follow me here. Georgiana marries a man, Lord Charles Bentinck, who, through his second wife, would become the great-great-grandfather of Queen Elizabeth II. That's a fun fact, but it doesn't help us get any closer to who commissioned this painting. Eventually, this painting was in the collection of the 5th Duke of Portland and was then passed on to the 6th Duke of Portland. And it was purchased by the Frick Collection in 1946 through Duveen. When she died, Grace Dalrymple Elliott took a few secrets with her. Who commissioned this intimate, sensuous painting? How much of her journal account is true? And what or whom, if anything, did she keep in that blue locket held so close to her heart? Every time I see her, when I walk in the galleries, every time I see her face, I get the sense that she would never tell. And I also think that if she were around today, she would have turned this Pimm's cup into a Pimm's Royale, which is to do away with the lemonade and to mix the Pimm's No. 1 with champagne. There's an idea for your weekend drink. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you next week.